That was me. The other thing was terms of the trade was very unequal. Even before at the beginning, there was supposed to be an equal footed trade where, the Europeans would bring in all these goods. And then at first, they started with gold. They would take gold away from Africa and then give Africans these imported commodities. Eventually, they started seeing that, okay, it might be better to, get the slaves instead of just gold. Both ways, gold and the slaves, economics call them more of productive stores of value. Gold, I was reading in another book that at a point, about 30% of the gold that was used in Europe was actually mined from Africa. That is crazy. And many of this gold was converted into like money, and money is a store of value. You can use it to build buildings. You can save it. You can, some countries actually, they didn't have paper money then, so it was literally gold that they were using as money. They would stamp it, they would mint it, and that's what they would spend. And much of this gold came from Africa. And what did they give Africans in exchange for those gold? Remember, there was no money then. So they will give Africans non-productive goods. So they will give them cowrie shells. And the crazy thing is that the cowrie shells that they got, reading in another book, that they picked these cowrie shells on the seashores of India, and those cowrie shells were just there. So they literally just pack these worthless things, ship them to Africa, gave them to the Africans. So Africans were exchanging tons and tons of valuable gold, and at some point, tons and tons of human beings that could farm, human beings that could, serve different sectors of society, human beings that could think and be innovative to improve their lot in life. Because that's one thing that Walter Rodney was emphasizing on. He said, what is development? Development is the process through which a person adapts and improves to answer the questions that the environment is throwing at him. So it's a person who is always looking over his shoulder for raiders. Is that the kind of person that would spend time on the farm farming? Of course not. The person who is captured by raiders and then sold as a slave outside of Africa, is that the kind of person that will be thinking about innovative things to improve the continent? Of course not. So Africa suffered a double whammy. First of all, productivity dropped because people were more on their guard. So people that would have been farming, they wouldn't have farmed because, as you're holding something, maybe someone, a raider will come on your blind side and just, kidnap you. So that was something that they were worried about. And then on the flip side, it would have been, kidnapping is never good, but it would have been good. It would have had a silver lining if the slaves that were being kidnapped were sent to other parts of Africa to work and to, grow stuff there. But that wasn't the case. So Africa was sparsely populated in the first place. This population explosion that they're talking about in Africa only started like probably in the last 50 years. As far back as, 400, 500 years ago, Africa was sparsely populated. So Africa didn't really have much population like that. So that's why even many of the cultural practices of Africa, like, the land, there was just so much land. So people could, like, migrate, set up new establishment, new communities and things like that because there was just a lot of land. So a sparsely populated continent that had vast amounts of land, then you introduce the trauma of slave trade. So you are depleting the population. And again, that is one way that's the title of the book stands out. That was one of the ways that Europe underdeveloped Africa, because the population that could have been solving problems that they needed to solve to survive in their environments, they didn't have the capacity to do that because, number one, they had to be on their guard. So someone that should be tinkering with their environment was like maybe locked up in their house, worrying about slave raiders. And then those who are unfortunate to be captured by slave raiders, they were not sent to work on other parts of Africa. They were sent outside Africa. So the few people that were left on the continent, they were the ones. It's very, very difficult to see development in that kind of situation. Then another thing that stood out to me was the idea that, I was alluding earlier about, like, at first the exchange was fairly equal, where, two parties wanted to were on fairly equal footing. The Europeans will bring in these goods. The Africans will bring in what they wanted to exchange them with. At the beginning, it was gold, which it wasn't really equal because, as I said earlier, the Europeans were giving Africans non-productive goods, goods that you couldn't store, goods that you couldn't invest. Whereas what they were extracting from, what they were getting from Africa was like people and gold. Gold, they could invest in it. The gold that they got from Africa, as I said earlier, that's 30% of the money that flowed in Europe during that time. It came from the gold mined from Africa. Another thing that you have to read between the lines in the book is that this industrial revolution, if you are familiar with European history, before the Industrial Revolution came the Age of Enlightenment, and it was during the Age of Enlightenment that's when people actually had time to sit down and think. And when you don't have to worry about survival, you don't have to worry about where your next food is going to come from. There's work for you. There's regular predictability in your environment because there are resources in your environment. That's when you can have the time. You can set aside the time to sit down and start thinking that, okay, why is it that this apple falls down from the tree? That's Isaac Newton. These guys were either they were rich or they had patrons that were able to, sponsor them to spend time thinking. And so they call that period the Age of Enlightenment because the proportion of society that had time to sit down and just think and contemplate the workings of the environment, the workings of the universe, that proportion increased. And then immediately after the Age of Enlightenment came the Industrial Revolution. So the ideas that the people were thinking about in the Age of Enlightenment, those ideas were then, converted into practical tools or the machines and things like that. And what Rodney is arguing is that you Europeans would have continued, struggling around looking for, they would have continued to be in a state of subsistence, looking for where their next meals will come from. However, because they interrupted a path of Africa's development, they were able to get the resources to address. So people who are no longer at that subsistence level, they had their basic needs met, and that meant that they could afford to spend time, or like their societies could afford to allocate people to be scientists, to be thinkers, and that created innovation. So in a roundabout way, the book is how Europe underdeveloped Africa, but the book could also be how Africa developed Europe. Because based on the resources, you have slaves working the farms, you have the gold that you harvested powering your banks and things like that. Walter Rodney actually traced the story of one of the biggest insurance companies in Britain, how the money they got to set up their business was actually profits from slave trade. So bottom line, the European societies had increased bandwidth to start thinking about these things, and that's what led to their acceleration in development.